Hello. Identity is the way that we view ourselves and the ways that we attempt to demonstrate that understanding to others. It is a complex philosophical process that we never really stop working on. Yet sometimes, in the course of our lives, we find it difficult to express who we are. Often, it's because labels have been applied to us that we can't really reconcile with our sense of self. Society tells us, directly or indirectly, how it wants us to behave and what the consequences might be if we refuse. When it gets really bad, we stop seeing ourselves as what we are and start seeing ourselves as what we aren't, all the ways, big and small, that we fail to live up to those expectations. And other times, the problem comes from within. We lose sight of our own dynamic nature. We outgrow the ways that we once defined ourselves, and suddenly we don't know who we are. During these times, these crises of identity, we feel uncertain, and that uncertainty can become a vulnerability. One of the great problems facing human beings in the 21st century is that we are not the only entities that care about who we are. There are institutions that are deeply invested in the ways that we express ourselves. They seek to reach in while we are confused and provide us with a sense of direction that suits their goals more than it does ours. The most dominant and influential of these institutions can be boiled down into two distinct categories: nation-states and limited liability companies. A nation-state is any political entity which seeks to cultivate a strong national identity among its citizens. It's an optimistic idea, in theory, unifying people with a communal sense of identity. In practice, though, it can be very problematic. For one, it's rare that these national identities are compatible with one another. For example, in the 20th century, two dominant world powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, had opposing economic strategies, capitalism and communism. This polarization ultimately led to the Cold War, which cost between 9 and 11 million human lives and threatened a nuclear conflict which could have made the world nearly uninhabitable for decades. And all the while, the people, both Americans and Soviets living under these systems, were suffering. The national identity of these nations was at perhaps its strongest ever. But even so, the people were suffering. A limited liability company is like any other corporation, except that it is granted pseudo-personhood under the law. This bizarre legal situation gives an LLC access to certain rights it would otherwise not have. An LLC can own other corporations, and it can be represented in a court of law. While these might seem like inconsequential differences, they can have a massive effect on how these organizations operate. An LLC is therefore a much more powerful kind of corporation. So, LLCs and nation-states are the two dominant kinds of institution in our world. But how do they relate to our identities as individuals? In a way, humans operating within organizations are like ants operating within a colony. A single ant might not understand the intentions of its colony, and yet the whole group is able to act almost as one organism, executing plans far beyond the understanding of any individual. Human organizations operate rather similarly. So, what are we to do as individuals? How are we to take the control of our identities out of the hands of these institutions and put it back into our own? Well, one might say you could counter consumerism by changing your spending habits, and you could counter excessive nationalism by voicing your political opinions and voting. These are both excellent ideas, to be clear, and are things that you should do whenever possible. But that alone is not enough. It is still playing by their rules, defining yourself by the way that you fit into the systems that have already been established. Another obvious answer might be to say, just get rid of the institutions that cause these problems in the first place. Tempting, maybe, but as much as I've faulted them, we do need institutions of some sort in our lives. The human mind can only really form meaningful connections with 150 other people or so. Beyond that, we start to group people into manageable categories and make untrue assumptions. We need organizations that can organize the billions of us that are on this planet. So it starts to seem like the only way to mitigate this hijacking of our identities by these national and corporate bodies is to completely mitigate the effect that they have on our lives. But that is a wildly complicated undertaking that goes far beyond the scope of any one TEDx talk. Truly, the only thing that we can do as individuals is minimize the extent to which these entities are able to dictate how we live our lives and how we express who we are. And this is a much more complicated undertaking than it might seem at first. After all, you are an entire human being with a depth of personality and a breadth of lived experience that nobody else could ever fully understand. I have developed 3 key strategies for building and rebuilding your identity. But the fact is that anything having to do with your identity is a deeply personal experience, and only you can decide what does and doesn't work for you. So, the first strategy is to engage in a kind of behavior called intersubjectivity. Intersubjectivity is a concept that emerged in social science about 50 years ago. It is the idea that understanding of oneself comes from understanding and interacting with others. This is the key concept that underlines intersubjectivity. You cannot fully understand yourself as a person until you learn to understand and accept other people. This might sound like the kind of psychology that only applies to children, but the truth is that the assumptions we make about the world as children continue to have lasting impacts on us throughout our entire lives. It is only by re-examining these fundamental childhood beliefs that we can make any significant impact in the ways that we see ourselves today. The second strategy is to engage with art, both as an artist and as an audience member. To discuss this properly, we're going to need to accept a very broad definition of art, that being that art is anything created by a person to communicate meaning. So, this means that just as the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and a beautiful opera are art, so are doodles in the margins of a notebook or simple tunes someone hums while doing chores. This is a key point that you need to understand. You don't have to write like Morrison or Shakespeare, paint like Kahlo or Monet, sculpt like Michelangelo or Rodin, compose like Verdi or Mozart. You just have to try to get yourself across in some way, be it in a poem or a song or anything else. What you will inevitably find is that you cannot create effective art without a deeper understanding of who you are, because truly effective art requires a lot of emotional honesty from its maker. However, the art you create will inevitably be shaped by the art that you consume. This is also an important aspect of your identity. The fact is that institutions also have access to the tools needed to create art. And while propaganda is sometimes obvious, it is usually not. It is key, therefore, to be wary of art created by institutions that seek to change your perspective in a way that serves their goals. Seek art that appeals to you, but also art that challenges your perspective and forces you to reconcile what you know with things you hadn't already considered. Do that, and you'll be well on your way to knowing a lot more about yourself. The third and final strategy is to rethink your spirituality. Religion, perhaps the oldest kind of institution, is simply organized spirituality. And while there's certainly a lot of benefit to be had in shared systems of belief, too often they are used as tools for directing people. It's important to remember that only you can decide your relationship with the spiritual. And none of this is to say that you need to abandon ideas you already believe in, only recontextualize and build off of them. By reaching out to other people and sharing your beliefs with them and accepting their beliefs in turn, you will learn more about other people, but also about your own beliefs. Now, if this isn't something that you're comfortable with, that's very understandable. But you can always conceptualize this approach as philosophical questioning. Philosophy and religion are really not all that different. It's just that the latter tends to be much more organized and is often framed through a relationship between humanity and some higher being or beings. Philosophy is often regarded as some sort of untouchable thing, but it is a right of every person to ask broad, complex questions about the universe and our place in it. So, nations, companies, houses of worship, etc., all of these institutions are ready to offer up a sense of identity whenever you feel lost. The ideal patriot or the ideal consumer. Whatever these molds may be, it is rare that they truly fit the people that they are placed upon. You need to remember in the 21st century that these institutions are trying to control you in insidious ways. And the only way to effectively combat that is to pay attention to the people around you, to pay attention to the art you make and the art you consume, and to rethink your beliefs. Now, it's also important to remember that not everyone will be comfortable with the sense of self that you establish and demonstrate to the world, but that's okay. It's important to remember that this is all about you. So long as you feel that you are comfortable with the sense of self you have created and that you are able to adequately express that sense of self to others, the rest of us can adapt. And none of this is to say that you are ever going to be perfect. It is a fact of being human that everybody has to change. But you should never change because an unthinking and unfeeling institution needs you to. Thank you so very much for your time.